In 1840, in the remote Yorkshire countryside of England, 9-year-old Margaret Ashworth is sold by her destitute parents to the enigmatic Duke of Thornwick Manor, a 65-year-old recluse rumoured to have buried 3 previous wives on his estate. The marriage contract contains a peculiar clause: Margaret must never speak again. As she's taken to the decaying manor, surrounded by fog and dead trees, Margaret discovers that silence isn't just her dowry. It's her survival. The Duke's estate hides a horrifying secret in its walls, and the previous child brides didn't die of natural causes. They discovered what the Duke keeps in the locked eastern wing, where strange sounds echo at midnight and small handprints stain the windows from the inside. Margaret must navigate a nightmare where speaking means death, but staying silent means becoming part of whatever darkness feeds in Thornwick Manor. The truth is far more disturbing than anyone could imagine, and it has been happening for over 2 centuries. There are some transactions in this world that should never happen. Deals made in desperate whispers that stain the soul of everyone involved, and on a rain-soaked evening in March of Margaret Ashworth's childhood was sold for 30 silver coins and a promise her parents would never have to see her again. She was 9 years old, and she didn't cry when her mother packed her small cloth bag, because she had learned long ago that tears only made her father angrier, and anger in their cramped London boarding house meant welts that lasted for weeks and hunger that lasted even longer. What Margaret didn't know, what her parents had carefully hidden from her until the very moment the black carriage arrived, was that she wasn't being sent to a distant relative or a charitable household. She was being delivered to Thornwick Manor as a bride, the 4th child bride of the Duke of Thornwick, a man whose age of 65 years made him seem ancient to her young eyes, whose reputation whispered through London's poorest districts like a ghost story told to frightened children into obedience. The man who came to collect her was not the Duke himself, but his steward, a rail-thin figure named Mr. Grimshaw, whose face looked like melted candle wax, pale and drooping, with eyes so deeply set in his skull that they appeared as black holes leading to nothing. He stood in the doorway of the Ashworth family's single room, water dripping from his long black coat onto the rotting floorboards, and he did not smile when he saw Margaret, did not offer any words of comfort or false promises about her new life. Instead, he simply extended one skeletal hand toward her father and said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping against stone, "The payment is agreed. The Duke expects her by nightfall." Margaret watched her father's trembling hands accept the small leather pouch, heard the clink of coins that sealed her fate, and she noticed how her mother turned away to face the cracked wall, shoulders shaking with either grief or relief. Margaret could never be certain which. "Come, child," Mr. Grimshaw said, and his voice carried no warmth, no acknowledgement that he was speaking to a living person, rather than a piece of furniture being moved from one room to another. Margaret looked at her parents one final time, searching their faces for some sign of regret, some indication that this was all a terrible mistake that would be corrected at the last moment. But her father was already counting the coins with feverish intensity, and her mother remained facing the wall, and Margaret understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that she had always been disposable to them, always been something to be endured rather than loved. She picked up her cloth bag, which contained only 2 worn dresses, a pair of shoes with holes in the soles, and a small wooden doll her grandmother had carved before she died, and she followed Mr. Grimshaw out into the rain without speaking, because what words could possibly matter now? The carriage waiting in the muddy street was like nothing Margaret had ever seen in the poverty-stricken neighborhood where she had spent her entire life. It was enormous and black, painted with a lacquer so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the horses pulling it were massive beasts, with coats the color of midnight and eyes that rolled white with what looked like fear. Miss Grimshaw opened the door and gestured for Margaret to climb inside, and when she hesitated, he placed one cold hand on her shoulder and pushed her forward, with surprising strength for someone who looked so frail. The interior of the carriage was lined with deep red velvet that felt like touching something alive, something that pulsed with its own heartbeat, and the air inside smelled of old roses and something underneath that Margaret couldn't identify, something sweet and rotting at the same time. She sat on the bench seat, clutching her bag to her chest, and Mr. Grimshaw climbed in after her, sitting directly across so that his knees almost touched hers in the confined space. As the carriage lurched forward, beginning the journey that would take them out of London and into the Yorkshire countryside, Mr. Grimshaw reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of parchment that crackled when he opened it. "The Duke has sent me to explain your new circumstances," he said, and Margaret noticed that he never blinked, that his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You are to become the Duchess of Thornwick, though the ceremony will be private and the marriage will not be conventional in the ways you might imagine." He paused, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his waxy face. "The Duke is a collector of sorts, you see. He collects rare things, precious things, and he has specific requirements for those who enter his household. The most important requirement, the one upon which your very survival depends, is silence." Margaret's hands tightened on her bag, and she wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand answers about what exactly she was being delivered into, but something in Mr. Grimshaw's expression stopped the words in her throat. He continued speaking, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality, like he was reciting something he had memorized long ago. "You must never speak again, child. Not a word, not a whisper, not a scream. The Duke values silence above all other virtues, and he has built his estate to preserve it. Those who speak at Thornwick Manor do not last long. They disappear into the walls, into the stones, into the very earth itself. Your dowry to the Duke is your silence, your eternal, unbreakable silence, and in return you will have shelter and food and protection from the cruelties of the world outside. Do you understand?" Margaret felt her throat close up, felt panic rising like bile, and she opened her mouth to protest, to say that this couldn't be real, that there were laws against such things. But Mr. Grimshaw moved with shocking speed, his hand clamping over her mouth with enough force to make her teeth cut into the inside of her lips. "I said, do you understand?" he repeated, and now his voice carried an edge like broken glass. "Your silence begins now. If you value your life, if you wish to see another sunrise, you will nod your head and you will never make another sound as long as you remain in the Duke's care, which will be for the rest of your days, however long or short that period may be." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she tasted blood from where her teeth had cut her mouth. But she nodded frantically, until Mr. Grimshaw removed his hand and settled back into his seat, once again staring at her with those terrible hollow eyes. The journey took 6 hours, and during that time, Mr. Grimshaw told her things that no 9-year-old child should ever have to hear. He told her about the 3 previous child brides, about Elizabeth, who had lasted 8 months before she was found at the bottom of the main staircase, with her neck twisted at an impossible angle, about Catherine, who had survived only 3 weeks before she vanished entirely, her room found empty one morning, with all her belongings still in place, as if she had simply evaporated, and about little Anne, who had made it almost a full year before she started screaming one night and couldn't be made to stop, and the servants had found her the next morning standing in the courtyard, silent finally, but with her eyes gone completely white, like boiled eggs. "They all spoke, you see," Grimshaw said, and he smiled then, really smiled, and it was the most horrible thing Margaret had ever witnessed, like watching a corpse try to express joy. "They thought the rule didn't apply to them, or they forgot in moments of fear or pain, or they simply couldn't bear the weight of silence anymore. But the Duke always knows, he always hears, and Thornwick Manor has a way of dealing with those who break its most sacred rule." Margaret pressed herself against the velvet-lined wall of the carriage, making herself as small as possible, and she tried not to think about what awaited her at the end of this journey. Through the small window, she watched as London's crowded streets gave way to open countryside, the buildings becoming fewer and farther between until there was nothing but fields and forests, and the occasional farmhouse flickering with candlelight. The rain continued to fall, turning the roads to mud that sucked at the carriage wheels, and as daylight faded into dusk and then into full darkness, Margaret felt like she was being carried away from everything human and familiar, being transported to some realm where normal rules no longer applied. Mr. Grimshaw dozed at some point, his head lolling against the carriage wall, but Margaret couldn't sleep, couldn't even close her eyes, because every time she did, she saw images of the previous child brides, saw them speaking their last words before whatever horror the Duke inflicted upon them. It was nearly midnight when the carriage finally turned off the main road onto a private drive that seemed to go on forever, winding through woods so dense that the trees formed a tunnel overhead, blocking out even the faint moonlight that had broken through the clouds. The temperature inside the carriage dropped noticeably, and Margaret could see her breath misting in the air, and she pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, but the cold seemed to come from inside her bones rather than from the outside air. Mr. Grimshaw woke as the carriage began to slow, and he straightened his coat and ran a hand through his sparse grey hair, and he looked at Margaret with something that might have been pity if he had been capable of such an emotion. "We're here," he said simply, and then the carriage stopped, and Margaret heard the driver climbing down from his seat, and the door opened to reveal not the servant she expected, but the Duke himself. He was tall, impossibly tall, at least 6.5 feet, and his body was thin to the point of being skeletal, all sharp angles and protruding bones beneath his expensive black clothing. His face was ancient, deeply lined and weathered, with skin that had a yellowish tint like old parchment, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the worst part. They were completely black, no visible whites or colored iris, just pure darkness that seemed to go on forever, like looking into wells that had no bottom. His hair was long and white, hanging past his shoulders, and his hands, when he extended one to help Margaret down from the carriage, were all bone and sinew, the fingers unnaturally long with nails that curved slightly like claws. He smiled when he saw her, and Margaret felt her bladder nearly release from sheer terror, because his teeth were wrong, too many of them and too sharp, like he had filed them to points. "Welcome, my dear, to Thornwick Manor," the Duke said, and his voice was surprisingly cultured, refined, with an accent that spoke of centuries of breeding and education, but underneath the civilized tone was something else, something hungry and ancient and wrong. "I am Duke Theodore Thornwick, and you are to be my wife, my companion, my treasured possession. Mr. Grimshaw has explained the rules, I trust." He looked at his steward, who nodded once, and the Duke's smile widened. "Excellent. Then let me show you to your new home, child. Let me show you the place where you will spend the rest of your days, however long or short they may be." Margaret wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except follow this nightmare creature into the massive stone building that loomed before them. But Mr. Grimshaw placed a hand on her back and pushed her forward, and she had no choice but to walk beside the Duke as he led her up the stone steps and through the enormous wooden doors that groaned open like the mouth of some great beast. The entrance hall of Thornwick Manor was cavernous, with a ceiling so high that Margaret couldn't see it in the darkness, and the walls were lined with portraits of serious-faced people who all had the Duke's black eyes. Generations of Thornwicks staring down at her with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to outright malevolence. Candles flickered in wall sconces, but their light seemed wrong somehow, more shadow than illumination, and Margaret realized that the flames were burning blue rather than yellow, giving everything a cold underwater quality. "Your rooms are prepared," the Duke said, gesturing toward a grand staircase that curved up into darkness. "You will find everything you need there, clothing, toiletries, books if you desire them, though I suspect you cannot read. No matter, you have no need of books where you are going." He paused at the base of the stairs and turned to look at her fully, and Margaret felt his gaze like a physical weight, crushing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. "Remember, child, your silence is your protection. As long as you remain mute, as long as you never utter a single sound, you are safe within these walls. But the moment you speak, the moment a word passes your lips, you become something else. You become food. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded frantically, and the Duke reached out and patted her head like she was a pet, and his touch was so cold it burned. "Good girl. Mr. Grimshaw will show you to your quarters. We will have the ceremony tomorrow evening. Sleep well, little bride. Sleep well and dream of silence." Mr. Grimshaw took her arm and led her up the staircase, and with each step, Margaret felt like she was descending rather than ascending, falling deeper into some trap from which there would be no escape. The second-floor hallway was lined with doors, dozens of them, all closed, and from behind several, Margaret heard sounds that made her blood freeze, scratching, like fingernails on wood, and soft crying that didn't sound quite human, and something else, a wet sliding sound, like something large moving through liquid. Grimshaw ignored all of it, pulling her along until they reached a door at the far end of the hall, and he produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it, pushing it open to reveal the room that would be her prison. It was larger than the entire space her family had occupied in London, with a four-poster bed draped in heavy curtains, a wardrobe that stood against one wall, a small desk with a chair, and a window that looked out over the manor grounds. Grimshaw lit several candles, and in their light, Margaret could see that the room was actually quite beautiful, with expensive wallpaper and thick rugs and all the comforts a child could want. But it felt wrong, felt like a gilded cage prepared for a bird that would never sing again. "The door locks from the outside," Mr. Grimshaw said, and Margaret heard the terrible finality in those words. "You will be released in the morning for breakfast. Do not attempt to leave this room during the night. The things that walk these halls after dark do not distinguish between those who belong and those who are merely visiting. They hunger, always, and a child alone would be convenient prey." He left then, and Margaret heard the key turn in the lock, and she was alone in the candle-lit room, with only her thoughts and her terror for company. She went to the window and looked out at the grounds, and what she saw made her understand why the three previous brides had all met terrible ends. The estate stretched out before her, in all directions, but it was dead, completely dead. The trees were bare and black, the grass was brown and withered, and scattered across the grounds were dozens of small graves, each marked with a simple stone. She counted them in the moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds. 47 graves, 47 small stones, 47 child brides who had come before her and who had not survived whatever secret Thornwick Manor held in its ancient bones. Margaret climbed into the enormous bed, still wearing her thin coat because the room was freezing despite the candles, and she clutched her wooden doll to her chest and tried not to cry because even crying made sound, and she didn't know if sounds of grief were permitted or if they too would summon whatever horror the Duke had warned her about. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the house around her, and it was not quiet, not silent at all. The manor groaned and creaked like a living thing, and somewhere far away she heard what sounded like chains dragging across stone, and once, just once, she heard a child's voice singing a lullaby, the words too distant to make out but the melody clear and heartbreaking and utterly impossible, because she was supposed to be the only child in this place. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony, the wedding that would bind her legally to the Duke, and Margaret understood that there would be no escape, no rescue, no miracle to save her. Her parents had sold her, and Mr. Grimshaw had brought her here, and the Duke was waiting to make her his fourth child bride, and somewhere in this house, in the walls or beneath the floors or in that eastern wing, she had noticed from the carriage that stood dark and separate from the main building, Something terrible was waiting for her to make a mistake, to speak, to scream, to give it permission to claim her, as it had claimed all the others. Margaret pressed her face into the pillow and prayed to a god she wasn't sure existed anymore. Prayed for strength, for courage, for the ability to remain silent no matter what horrors awaited her. And as she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, she heard the Duke's voice echoing through her mind, that terrible promise that would haunt every moment of her life from this night forward. Your silence is your protection. Your silence is your dowry. Your silence is all that stands between you and the darkness that feeds in these walls. Margaret woke to the sound of her door unlocking, the metallic scrape of the key turning, pulling her from nightmares where she had been running through endless corridors while something with too many teeth chased her through the darkness. For a moment she forgot where she was, and then the reality crashed down on her like freezing water. She was in Thornwick Manor. She was the Duke's bride-to-be, and she could never speak again if she wanted to survive. A maid stood in the doorway, a woman perhaps 30 years old, with a plain face and empty eyes that reminded Margaret of the dolls in shop windows, beautiful but completely devoid of life or personality. The maid gestured for Margaret to follow, not speaking, and Margaret realized with a cold shock that perhaps the rule of silence applied to everyone in this household, that the entire manor might be populated by people who had forgotten how to use their voices or had never been allowed to learn. She followed the maid down the hallway, and in the morning light that filtered through the tall windows, Margaret could see details she had missed in last night's darkness. The wallpaper was patterned with intricate designs that at first looked like flowers, but upon closer inspection revealed themselves to be twisted faces. Hundreds of tiny screaming faces, woven into the pattern so subtly that you had to stare directly at them to see them clearly. The portraits that lined the walls were even more disturbing in daylight. Every single Thornwick ancestor had those same black eyes, that same predatory smile, and in several of the paintings, Margaret could see small figures in the background, children standing in shadows or peeking from behind furniture, and all of them had their hands pressed over their mouths as if holding in screams. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, but it wasn't the normal settling sound of an old building. It sounded almost like words, like the house itself was trying to communicate in a language Margaret couldn't understand. The maid led her to a dining room that could have easily seated 50 people, but contained only one place setting at the far end of an enormous table that stretched the entire length of the room. The Duke was already there, standing by the window with his back to her, and he was wearing a burgundy dressing gown that made him look like a splash of blood against the grey morning light. He turned when he heard them enter, and his smile was even more terrible, in daylight revealing all those sharpened teeth, and Margaret noticed for the first time that his fingernails were stained dark at the tips, like he had been digging in soil or something worse. "Good morning, my dear child," he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast room. "I trust you slept well despite the house's various nocturnal disturbances. Thornwick Manor is quite old, you understand, and old places have their own rhythms, their own needs and hungers that must be satisfied." She gestured for her to sit, and Margaret walked the length of the table to the single chair, feeling his eyes on her the entire time, tracking her movements like a cat watching a mouse. The maid brought food, porridge and bread and jam and tea, and it smelled wonderful after months of near starvation in London. But Margaret's stomach was twisted with fear, and she could barely force herself to take a bite. The Duke sat at the opposite end of the table, so far away that she could hardly see his face clearly, and he watched her eat with an intensity that made every swallow difficult. "You are wondering, no doubt, about your duties here," he said, and his voice echoed strangely in the large room, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "You are wondering what exactly I expect from a 9-year-old bride, what perverse purposes I might have for acquiring children and calling them my wives." Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, not daring to look up, and she heard the Duke laugh, a sound like dry bones rattling in a bag. "The truth is far stranger than whatever your young mind has imagined, child. I do not want you in the ways that men typically want wives. I have no interest in your body, no desire for physical intimacy or companionship in any conventional sense. What I want, What I have always wanted, what my father wanted and his father, before him, stretching back 7 generations, is something much more valuable than flesh. I want your silence. I need your silence. The house needs your silence. There is something in the eastern wing, you see, something that has been in my family's keeping since this manor was built in 1623, and it feeds on sound, on vibration, on the specific frequencies produced by human voices, and particularly by the voices of children, which carry a certain purity, a certain resonance, that adult voices lack. He stood and began walking slowly around the table toward her, and Margaret wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey, terror rooting her to the chair. Every generation of Thornwicks has served as wardens, as keepers of this thing, this entity that lives in our walls and beneath our floors. We feed it silence, you see. We bring it children who cannot speak, who will not speak, who have agreed through their very presence here to never make another sound, and in exchange it grants us certain privilege. Long life. For one, I am not truly 65 years old, child. I am 143, kept alive by the arrangement my family made centuries ago. Wealth beyond measure. For another, the Thornwick fortune never diminishes, never fails, no matter how we spend or how poorly we invest. And protection from the normal ailments that plague humanity, disease, injury, aging, all of it held at bay as long as we continue to feed the entity what it craves. He was directly behind her now, and Margaret felt his cold hand rest on her shoulder, those 2 long fingers curling around her collarbone like a cage. But the entity is hungry always, and silence alone is not enough. It requires failure. It requires those who break the rule, who speak when they should not, who scream or cry out or whisper in the darkness. Those children become food in a different way, become sustenance that keeps the entity satisfied for weeks or even months. Elizabeth, Catherine, Anne, they all served their purpose eventually. They all fed the hunger. And you, little Margaret, you will either maintain your silence perfectly and live out your days in relative comfort, or you will speak and become another meal, another sacrifice to the thing that lives in the eastern wing. He removed his hand and walked back to his end of the table, and Margaret realized she had been holding her breath, and when she released it, the sound seemed terribly loud in the vast dining room. The ceremony tonight is merely a formality, the Duke continued, sitting back in his chair and steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A legal protection ensuring that no one can take you from this place, that no authorities can interfere with our arrangement. You will sign papers, or rather you will make your mark, as I doubt you can write, and then you will be mine in the eyes of the law, mine to keep in this manor until the day you die, whether that is next week or in 70 years. Miss Grimshaw will spend today teaching you the layout of the house and explaining which areas are safe and which are forbidden. The eastern wing is absolutely prohibited. The doors are locked, and even if you found a way inside, you would not survive the encounter. Do you understand? Margaret nodded, and the Duke smiled his horrible smile. Excellent. You may finish your breakfast and then begin your education. I have business to attend to in my study, but I will see you this evening for the ceremony. Wear the white dress you will find in your wardrobe. It belonged to Anne. She won't be needing it anymore. He stood and walked toward the door, but he paused before leaving and turned back to look at her, one final time. Oh, and child, the crying you heard last night, the singing, that was not your imagination. There are others here, other children who came before you, who survived long enough to become something else. You may see them in the corridors, in the mirrors, in the shadows that move when they should not. Do not acknowledge them. Do not respond to them in any way. They are no longer fully human, and they exist in a state between life and death, sustained by the entity's power but trapped in this house forever. If you speak to them, if you make any sound in their presence, they will tell the entity, and it will come for you. Remember always, silence is your only protection. Then he was gone. And Margaret was alone in the vast dining room with her half-eaten breakfast and her racing heart, and the terrible knowledge that she had been brought to a place where the normal rules of reality did not apply, where something ancient and hungry waited in a forbidden wing, where children who broke the silence became food for an entity that had been feeding for over 200 years. She pushed her plate away, no longer able to pretend to eat, and the maid appeared as if summoned by thought rather than sound, taking the dishes away with efficient mechanical movements that confirmed Margaret's suspicion that the servants here were not fully human anymore, that they had been in the Duke's service so long that whatever made them individuals had been worn away, leaving only empty shells that moved and worked but did not truly live. Mr. Grimshaw arrived shortly after, appearing in the doorway like a spectre, his waxy face expressionless, as always. He gestured for Margaret to follow him, and they began what he called the tour, though it felt more like a catalogue of dangers and forbidden places than any welcoming introduction to her new home. The manor was enormous, containing over 60 rooms spread across 3 floors, and every single space felt wrong in subtle ways that Margaret couldn't quite articulate. The angles of the corners were slightly off. The distances between doors seemed to change depending on which direction you approached from, and the windows never quite showed the same view twice, as if the grounds outside were shifting and rearranging themselves when no one was looking directly at them. Mr. Grimshaw showed her the library where thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but when Margaret looked closely, she saw that many of the titles were written in languages that used alphabets she didn't recognize, and some of the books appeared to be bound in leather that had a texture uncomfortably similar to human skin. He showed her the drawing room, where a magnificent piano sat in one corner, its keys yellowed with age, and he made a point of telling her that the piano must never be played, that music was even more dangerous than speech because it carried emotional resonance that the entity found particularly delicious. He showed her the conservatory where plants grew in wild profusion, but they were all wrong somehow. Flowers that bloomed in colors that hurt to look at directly, vines that seemed to reach toward her as she passed, and a small tree in the center that bore fruit that looked like human heart, pulsing gently as if still connected to invisible bodies. The second floor contained the bedrooms, dozens of them, most standing empty but all maintained as if expecting guests who never arrived. Grimshaw pointed out which rooms had belonged to the previous child brides, and Margaret noticed that the doors to those rooms were marked with small symbols carved into the wood. Elizabeth's door had a cross, Catherine's had a crescent moon, Anne's had a star. Her own door, she realized, bore a triangle, and she wondered what significance these symbols held, whether they were protective wards or markers for the entity, signs indicating which rooms contained potential prey. At the end of the second-floor hallway was a door different from all the others, made of black iron rather than wood, and covered with locks and chains and symbols that looked like they had been carved by someone who didn't understand proper letters, someone who was trying to write in a language that human mouths were never meant to speak. "The eastern wing lies beyond that door," Mr. Grimshaw said, and for the first time since Margaret had met him, she heard something like emotion in his voice. Fear, deep and genuine. "Do not ever, under any circumstances, attempt to open it. Do not touch the door. Do not stand near it longer than necessary. The entity can sense interest, can feel curiosity like heat, and if it believes you want to enter, it will find ways to encourage that desire, will whisper to you through the walls, will show you visions that make you believe opening the door is the most important thing in the world." 3 of the previous brides tried to enter the eastern wing. None of them succeeded in opening the door, but their attempts marked them, made them visible to the entity in ways that sealed their fates. "You understand?" Margaret nodded, staring at the iron door, and she could swear she heard something behind it, a sound like breathing, like something massive inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that was just slightly too slow to be human. Mr. Grimshaw grabbed her arm and pulled her away. his grip surprisingly strong, and they continued the tour, descending to the ground floor where he showed her the kitchens, vast and ancient, with fireplaces large enough to roast entire animals, and the servants' quarters, where the staff lived in small cell-like rooms that reminded Margaret of pictures she had seen of prisons. The servants themselves were like the maid who had fetched her that morning, moving about their duties with mechanical precision, but never speaking, never even looking at each other, as if they existed in separate realities that only occasionally overlapped. The final stop on the tour was the chapel, a small room at the rear of the manor that had been converted for the Duke's private use. It was there that the ceremony would take place that evening, Miss Grimshaw explained, and Margaret saw that the altar had been prepared with candles and flowers, and a thick book that looked ancient beyond measure, its pages made of something that wasn't quite paper, more like pressed leaves or thin slices of bone. "The ceremony is binding," Miss Grimshaw said, running one finger along the altar's edge. "Once completed, you are the Duke's property, in all ways recognized by law and by the entity itself. There is no escape after tonight, no possibility of rescue or reprieve. Your parents signed papers relinquishing all claims to you, and the authorities have been paid to look the other way, as they have been paid for generations. You belong to Thornwick Manor now, to the Duke and to the thing he serves, and you will remain here until you die or until the entity decides it no longer has use for you." Margaret felt tears beginning to build behind her eyes, but she forced them back, forced herself to remain composed, because even crying made sound, and she wasn't certain whether the sound of weeping would be forgiven or would mark her as weak, as prey. Miss Grimshaw led her back to her room, and this time he left the door unlocked, which seemed significant somehow, as if the Duke was confident enough in his control over her that he no longer needed physical barriers to keep her contained. Margaret went to the window again and looked out at the grounds, at those 47 graves scattered across the dead landscape, and she to imagine what her own marker would look like when she inevitably joined them, because she couldn't conceive of a scenario where she survived this place, where she maintained perfect silence for the rest of her life, while living in a house that seemed designed to make her scream. The afternoon passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour, and Margaret explored her room more thoroughly, finding things the maid must have placed there while she was at breakfast. The white dress the Duke had mentioned, beautiful and expensive, and sized perfectly for her, as if they had known her measurements before she arrived, and a pair of white shoes and white ribbons for her hair. In the desk drawer she found paper and pencils, and she realized with a sudden flash of hope that perhaps this was how she could communicate, how she could survive without speech. She could write questions, write pleas for help, write anything that needed to be expressed without breaking the rule of silence. But when she tried to write, when she pressed pencil to paper and attempted to form letters, the graphite simply slid across the surface without leaving any mark, as if the paper was coated with something that repelled ink and lead alike. She tried another sheet with the same result, and another, and she understood that this too was part of the Duke's design, that he had eliminated even this escape route, ensuring that she would remain truly silent, unable to communicate in any form. As evening approached, Margaret heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, not the soft padding of servants, but something heavier, more deliberate, and then a child's voice, clear and high and impossible, saying, "You should run while you still can." "We couldn't, but maybe you're faster, maybe you're smarter, maybe you'll make it past the gates before he catches you." Margaret went to her door and opened it slightly, peering out into the corridor, and she saw a girl standing there, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, wearing a dress from a style at least 50 years out of fashion. The girl's face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were filmed over with white, like cataracts, and she was staring directly at Margaret, even though she clearly couldn't see, not in any normal sense. "That's Elizabeth," the girl said, though her lips didn't move properly, the words seeming to come from somewhere behind or inside her. "I can feel you listening, new girl. I can feel your fear. It tastes like copper and smoke. The Duke told you about us, didn't he? The ones who failed, the ones who spoke when we shouldn't have. But he didn't tell you the whole truth. We didn't die. We can't die. The entity keeps us alive, keeps us trapped between, because our failures feed it in an ongoing way, a constant stream of regret and terror that it finds nourishing. We exist to warn the new brides, to make them so afraid that they slip up, that they scream or cry out, and then the entity gets to feed again, and the cycle continues. Margaret wanted to slam the door, wanted to hide under her bed like a much younger child, but she found herself frozen, listening to this ghost girl's words. "Don't trust the silence," Elizabeth continued, drifting closer without actually walking, her feet not quite touching the floor. "The silence is a lie. The house is never truly quiet. You'll hear things, see things, and you'll want to scream so badly that you'll bite through your own tongue trying to stop yourself. And eventually you will fail. Everyone fails. The Duke knows this, the entity knows this, and they're patient. They have centuries of practice at waiting for children to break. Anne lasted almost a year, but she broke eventually, screamed herself raw when she saw what leaves in the eastern wing. Catherine tried to escape after 3 weeks, tried to run, and they found her at the gates with her throat torn out, but still alive, still conscious, still trapped. And I lasted 8 months before I forgot, before I laughed at something I saw in the library, just one small laugh, and it was enough. The ghost girl reached out as if to touch Margaret's face, and Margaret flinched back, pressing against the doorframe, and Elizabeth smiled sadly. "You're smart not to speak to me, smart not to acknowledge me beyond listening, but know this, new girl, the entity is already aware of you. It knows you're here. It's measuring you, testing you, finding your weaknesses, and when it discovers the right pressure point, when it learns exactly what will make you break your silence, it will push and push until you shatter. There is no escape from Thornwick Manor. There is only the choice between dying quickly by speaking or dying slowly by maintaining silence until your mind breaks from the strain. Choose wisely, little bride. Choose wisely, and pray your choice matters more than mine did." Then Elizabeth faded, not walking away but simply becoming less solid, less present, until Margaret was staring at an empty hallway, lit by the fading afternoon sun through the tall windows. She closed her door and locked it from the inside, though she knew the lock would do nothing to keep out ghosts or entities, or the Duke himself, and she sat on her bed and tried to prepare herself mentally for the ceremony that would seal her fate. The white dress mocked her from where it hung on the wardrobe door, a symbol of innocence and purity being used to mark her as property, as livestock being consecrated before slaughter. Margaret picked up her wooden doll, the last connection to her old life, and she held it close and tried not to think about her parents counting their 30 silver coins, tried not to imagine them sleeping peacefully in their boarding house while she sat in this cursed manor, waiting to be married to a monster who served something even worse. When Miss Grimshaw came to collect her, as full darkness fell outside, Margaret had already dressed herself in the white gown and shoes, had already braided her hair with the white ribbons, had already accepted that tonight she would cease to be Margaret Ashworth and would become instead the Duchess of Thornwick, the 4th child bride, the latest in a long line of sacrifices made to appease an entity that fed on silence and fear. She followed Mr. Grimshaw down the stairs, through the corridors, to the small chapel, where candles burned with that same blue flame she had noticed the night before, and she saw the Duke waiting at the altar in formal attire that made him look even more like an animated corpse, and she saw the servants gathered along the walls like witnesses to an execution, and she walked down the short aisle toward her doom with her head held high, because if she was going to be trapped in this nightmare, if she was going to spend whatever remained of her life maintaining perfect silence while surrounded by horrors, then she would at least face it with whatever small dignity a 9-year-old child could muster. The ceremony was conducted in Latin by a priest who looked as old and withered as the Duke himself, and Margaret understood none of the words but felt their weight, felt them binding her to this place with invisible chains that would never break. She made her mark where instructed, pressing her thumb onto an ink pad and then onto the ancient register, and she saw the names above hers: Elizabeth Winters, Catherine Moore, Anne Fletcher, and she wondered if anyone would ever look at this book in the future and see her name and wonder what had become of Margaret Ashworth. The Duke placed a ring on her finger, a heavy golden band set with a black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and he kissed her forehead with lips like ice and Miss Grimshaw, and the servants bowed as if witnessing something sacred rather than something obscene, and then it was done. She was married. She was the Duchess of Thornwick. She belonged to the Duke and to the entity he served, and as the candles flickered and the shadows danced on the chapel walls, Margaret heard something in the distance, something in the eastern wing, a sound like chains dragging and vast breathing, and something else, something that might have been laughter or might have been hunger or might have been both, and she knew that the entity was aware of her now, was watching her, was waiting with infinite patience for her to make the single mistake that would transform her from bride to meal, from person to food, from living girl to one more ghost, trapped forever in the walls of Thornwick Manor. Margaret's first week at Thornwick Manor passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion, each day bleeding into the next, with no clear markers to distinguish Tuesday from Thursday, or morning from afternoon, except for the quality of light that filtered through the windows and the meals that appeared at regular intervals, whether she had appetite for them or not. She learned quickly that the Duke kept to a strict schedule: breakfast at 8, during which he would sit at his end of the enormous dining table and watch her eat while making observations about the weather or the state of the gardens or the particular quality of silence she maintained, always speaking as if they were having a normal conversation despite her inability to respond. Lunch was solitary, brought to her room by the blank-faced maid, and dinner was another performance in the dining room where the Duke would tell her stories about his family history, about the various Thornwick ancestors whose portraits lined the walls, about the construction of the manor, and the peculiar circumstances under which the entity had first come to inhabit the eastern wing. She learned the rhythms of the house, the way certain floorboards creaked at specific times regardless of whether anyone walked on them, the way doors would open and close on their own when the wind outside was perfectly still, the way shadows moved independently of any light source and sometimes formed shapes that looked disturbingly human before dissolving back into ordinary darkness. She learned which corridors were safe to walk during daylight hours and which should be avoided even then. The third-floor hallway that led to the servants' old quarters smelled of rot and disease despite being cleaned daily, and anyone who spent too long there developed splitting headaches and nosebleeds that wouldn't stop until they left that section of the house. She learned that the library was relatively safe as long as you didn't try to read the books bound in that leather that wasn't leather, and that the conservatory was tolerable in the mornings but became oppressively hot by afternoon, hot enough that the strange plants would start secreting a thick, sweet-smelling sap that made you drowsy and gave you dreams of being buried alive in soil that was warm and wet and pulsing like living tissue. But most importantly, Margaret learned about the servants, the 7 people who maintained Thornwick Manor and attended to the Duke's needs, and she learned that calling them people was generous, because whatever they had been when they first came to work for the Thornwick family, they had long since become something else, something less, and also somehow more, transformed by years or decades of exposure to the entity's influence into creatures that mimicked humanity without truly possessing it. There was Mrs. Holloway, the head housekeeper, a woman who might have been 50 or might have been 80, with grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and a face that never showed any expression except a slight downturning of the mouth that might have been disapproval or might have been the natural resting state of muscles that had forgotten how to smile. There was Mr. Brennan, the groundskeeper who Margaret only saw from her window as he moved through the dead gardens with his tools, pruning trees that bore no leaves, and tending to flower beds where nothing grew except those heart-fruit plants and other vegetation that shouldn't exist in this climate or perhaps shouldn't exist at all. There was the cook, whose name Margaret never learned because no one ever spoke it, a massive woman who moved with surprising grace despite her size and who prepared meals that tasted delicious but always left Margaret feeling slightly ill afterward, as if the food contained some ingredient her body recognized as foreign and dangerous, even if her tongue did not. There were 2 housemaids besides the one who attended Margaret, Sarah, and another girl whose name Margaret thought might be Jane, but couldn't be certain because they never introduced themselves and looked so similar. They might have been twins, both with the same pale skin and dark hair and eyes that reflected light like animal eyes in the dark. There was Miss Grimmerham, of course, who served as steward and general manager of the household, coordinating the servants and attending to the Duke's business and maintaining the various locks and barriers that kept the eastern wing sealed. And finally there was Thomas, a boy of perhaps 14, who served as footman and general errand runner, and he was the only servant who sometimes showed flickers of emotion, fear, mostly, especially when tasks required him to venture near the iron door that led to the forbidden wing. On the 8th day of her residence at Thornwick Manor, Margaret encountered Thomas in the second-floor hallway while returning from the library where she had spent the morning looking at picture books, the only volumes that seemed safe to examine, though even the illustrations sometimes showed things that weren't there when you first looked at the page, but appeared when you glanced away and looked back. Extra figures in the backgrounds of pastoral scenes or faces hidden in the patterns of wallpaper depicted in drawings of fancy rooms. Thomas was carrying a tray laden with cleaning supplies, and when he saw Margaret, he stopped and stared at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, and then he did something remarkable. He glanced around to ensure they were alone, and then he spoke, actually spoke, his voice barely a whisper, but unmistakably real. "You're different from the others," he said, and Margaret's eyes widened in shock because she had assumed all the servants were mute like her, bound by the same rule of silence. "You're still yourself. I can see it in your eyes." Elizabeth was already broken when she arrived. Catherine was too young to really understand what was happening, and Anne fought so hard, but she was fighting the wrong battle. She thought if she could just survive long enough, someone would rescue her. But no one comes to Thornwick Manor unless they've been brought here, unless they've been marked for this place. He set down his tray and moved closer, and Margaret noticed that his hands were shaking. "The servants can speak," he continued, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear him. "We're allowed to speak to each other when the Duke is not present, and when we're not near the eastern wing, because we're not the entity's primary food source. It prefers children, young voices, innocent voices. Adult speech is like stale bread to it, sustaining but not satisfying. But we still have to be careful, still have to measure every word, because the entity listens always, and if we say something that interests it, something that carries strong emotion, it can mark us, can decide that maybe an adult voice might be worth consuming after all." Margaret wanted desperately to ask questions, to demand answers about the entity and the eastern wing and whether there was any possibility of escape. But she couldn't risk speaking, couldn't trust that Thomas wasn't some kind of test arranged by the Duke to see if she would break her silence. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas smiled sadly. "You're smart not to talk to me. I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. But I'm going to tell you some things anyway. Things the Duke won't tell you because he wants you to discover them, slowly. Wants you to exist in a state of constant uncertainty and fear. Because that fear has its own flavor, and the entity feeds on it too. Though not as directly as it feeds on sound." He picked up a cloth from his tray and began polishing a nearby mirror, making his words look like simple conversation during ordinary work in case anyone should observe them. "The entity has been here since 1623, as the Duke told you, but what he didn't tell you is how it came to be here, how his ancestor, the first Duke of Thornwick, brought it from somewhere else and imprisoned it in the eastern wing." Thomas's reflection in the mirror looked wrong somehow, slightly out of sync with his actual movements, and Margaret wondered if this was a property of all the mirrors in Thornwick Manor, or if it was specific to this one. The first Duke was an occultist, a man obsessed with obtaining power and immortality, and he traveled to places that don't exist on any map, places between places where the rules of reality are more like suggestions than laws. He found the entity there, or perhaps it found him, and they made a bargain. He would provide it with a steady supply of what it craved most, and it would grant him and his descendants all the gifts the Duke told you about. Long life, endless wealth, immunity to disease and injury. But the entity required very specific food. It required the sound of children's voices, particularly the sound of children breaking under pressure, children screaming or crying or laughing in hysteria, children making the noises that only come from innocence being destroyed. So the first Duke built the eastern wing specifically to house the entity, and he began acquiring children from poor families, orphans and street urchins that no one would miss, and he would bring them to Thornwick Manor and lock them in the eastern wing until they made noise, until they broke the silence, and then the entity would feed. The cloth in Thomas's hands was moving in circles on the mirror's surface, round and round, hypnotic, and Margaret found herself unable to look away from his reflection. This went on for almost a century, the Thornwick family stealing children and feeding them to the entity, until people began to notice, began to ask questions about the Duke's collection of children and why none of them were ever seen again. So the family changed their method. They began arranging marriages instead, legal transactions that gave them ownership of children in ways that couldn't be questioned or investigated. They would find desperate families and offer them money in exchange for a daughter, and they would marry the child to whoever was Duke at that time, making her a legal member of the family and therefore protected from outside interference. The child brides were told they must maintain silence, and the ones who managed it were allowed to live in relative comfort, growing older within the manor's walls, eventually becoming part of the household staff when they aged out of being useful to the entity in the way it preferred. Miss Holloway was a child bride once, 70 years ago. Sarah and Jane were child brides 40 years ago. They survived by maintaining perfect silence, and the entity eventually lost interest in them as they matured, and they chose to stay because leaving Thornwick Manor after being here so long is impossible. The entity's influence becomes part of you, gets into your bones and blood, and those who try to leave find themselves pulled back, sometimes walking in their sleep all the way from London or Manchester or wherever they fled to, walking until they're back at the manor gates. Thomas finally stopped polishing the mirror and turned to face Margaret directly, and she saw tears running down his face, though his expression remained neutral, his voice still that same quiet whisper. I was a child bride too, in a sense. The Duke acquired me when I was 7, not as a bride but as a servant, bought from a workhouse where I was starving to death. He told me if I could maintain silence for 5 years, I would be allowed to speak again, allowed to join the regular staff instead of being entity food. I managed it somehow. 5 years of perfect silence, and when I turned 12, the Duke kept his word. But by then, something had changed in me. I had spent so long not speaking that my thoughts had become strange, had started to sound like they belonged to someone else, and I realized that even though I could speak now, I was still trapped, still property of Thornwick Manor, still bound to serve the Duke and the entity for the rest of my life, because I had nowhere else to go and no other skills except surviving in a cursed house. He wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand, and Margaret saw that his eyes were bloodshot, exhausted. There are others like me in the house, children, who survived their trial periods and became servants, and we all watch the new brides arrive, and we all try to help in small ways without drawing the Duke's attention, because if he thinks we're interfering with his arrangement with the entity, he'll throw us into the eastern wing and lock the door and let the entity have us regardless of our age or how long we've served him. That's what happened to Peter, one of the former footmen who tried to help Anne escape. He unlocked the front gates for her one night and gave her directions to the nearest village, and she ran, but she didn't get more than a mile before the entity's influence pulled her back. The Duke discovered Peter's betrayal and punished him by opening the eastern wing door and pushing him through, And we all heard his screaming for 3 days before it finally stopped. And now sometimes we see him in the hallways at night. What's left of him, crawling on the ceiling like an insect, making wet clicking sounds that might be attempts at speech, or might be something else entirely. Margaret felt her stomach turn, felt bile rising in her throat. But she forced herself to remain composed, to keep listening because Thomas was giving her information that might prove vital to her survival. He picked up his tray again, preparing to move on before someone noticed him lingering too long in one place. I'm telling you this because you have a quality the others lacked. You have rage. I can see it behind your eyes, underneath the fear. You're angry about what was done to you, angry at your parents for selling you, angry at the Duke for buying you, angry at the world for allowing places like Thornwick Manor to exist. Hold on to that rage, Margaret. Let it burn inside you, but never let it out as sound. Rage can keep you alive if you channel it properly, if you use it to fuel your determination to survive, rather than letting it explode into screams or curses. The entity feeds on fear and pain and despair, but it doesn't know what to do with cold, controlled anger. It confuses the entity, makes it harder for it to read you, to find your breaking point. He started walking away, but he paused after a few steps and turned back one more time. One more thing. The eastern wing has 7 rooms, and each room contains one of the entity's previous meals. Children who broke their silence and were consumed but not completely, kept in a state between life and death, as trophies or reserves or ongoing food sources. I don't fully understand the entity's reasoning. Sometimes you can hear them in there, crying or singing or laughing, all the sounds the entity has collected from them playing on an endless loop. If you ever hear a child's voice calling your name specifically, if you ever hear someone claiming to be your sister or your friend, or someone who knew you before you came here, do not respond. Do not even acknowledge that you heard it. The entity uses the voices it has collected to lure new victims, to make them speak in response, and once you speak, once you make any sound in response to its calls, you've given it permission to claim you, you've marked yourself as prey, and nothing can protect you after that. Then Thomas was gone, disappearing around a corner with his tray of cleaning supplies, and Margaret was alone in the hallway, with her thoughts racing and her heart pounding, and the terrible knowledge that the situation was worse than she had imagined. The entity wasn't just some abstract horror living behind a locked door. It was active, hunting, using the voices of its previous victims to trap new ones, and the children in the eastern wing weren't dead, but were being kept alive somehow, trapped in perpetual suffering, their sounds harvested and replayed like some macabre music box. She thought of the 7 rooms Thomas had mentioned, and she wondered how many children had been fed to the entity over the centuries, how many small bodies were trapped in that forbidden wing, aware but unable to escape, existing in agony for decades or longer, while the Thornwick family continued their arrangement, generation after generation of dukes buying children and feeding them to something that should never have been brought into this world. Margaret returned to her room and found the maid, the one whose name she didn't know, waiting there with fresh linens for the bed, and Margaret looked at her closely for the first time, really looked, and I saw the signs that Thomas had mentioned. The woman's face was too smooth, too ageless, frozen somewhere between 30 and 60, with skin that had a waxy quality like a death mask. Her movements were fluid, but slightly wrong, as if she were remembering how humans moved, rather than moving naturally. And her eyes, when Margaret managed to meet them, were filled with the same white cloudiness that Elizabeth's ghost eyes had shown, suggesting that whatever process kept the former child brides alive and serving the Duke also changed them fundamentally, damaged them, in ways that couldn't be repaired even if they ever escaped this place. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to the house's nocturnal sounds, and she tried to distinguish between normal settling noises and the sounds Thomas had warned her about. The recorded voices the entity played from the eastern wing. She heard wind whistling through unseen cracks, heard the distant hooting of an owl, heard the creak and groan of old wood and stone, and underneath it all, she heard something else. Something rhythmic and organic, like breathing or like waves on a shore. A sound so low it was almost subsonic, but present enough that she could feel it in her chest, could feel it matching her own heartbeat, and then slowly, gradually trying to alter it, trying to sync her body's rhythms to its own. She pressed her hands over her ear, but the sound didn't diminish because it wasn't coming from outside her body. It was coming from the house itself, from the entity's presence in the eastern wing radiating through the walls and floors. A constant low-frequency pulse that said, "I am here, I am waiting, I am patient, I will have you eventually." On the 10th day, Margaret encountered her second ghost, though this one was different from Elizabeth in fundamental ways that made it clear not all the trapped children existed in the same state or followed the same rules. She was in the conservatory examining one of the heartfruit plants. The fruit had ripened to a deep purple color and was making a faint thumping sound that perfectly mimicked a human heartbeat when she felt a presence behind her and turned to see a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, standing among the vines wearing a dress that was old-fashioned even by 1840 standards, something from the previous century with panniers and stays and elaborate embroidery. The girl's face was beautiful and terrible at the same time, perfectly preserved like a porcelain doll, but with eyes that were completely black. Not like the Duke's eyes, which were just very dark, but actually black, as if someone had cut holes in her face that opened onto an infinite void. The girl tilted her head at an angle that was slightly too far to be natural, almost 90 degrees to the side, and she smiled, showing teeth that were all baby teeth, too small and too white, and too many of them crowded into her small mouth. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and Margaret braced herself for whatever lure the entity would use, whatever familiar voice it would play to try to trick her into responding. But no sound came out. Instead, the girl's mouth opened wider and wider, unhinging like a snake's jaw, and from inside came a gust of cold air that smelled of decay and earth, and something chemical like formaldehyde, and mixed with that smell was a faint sound. Children singing in a language Margaret didn't recognize, dozens or hundreds of voices layered on top of each other, creating a chorus that was beautiful and nauseating in equal measure. Margaret wanted to run but found herself frozen, unable to move, and the ghost girl with the black eyes and impossible mouth drifted closer, without walking, floating a few inches above the conservatory floor. And Margaret could see now that she had no shadow, that the light passed through her in places, making her seem more like a projection than a solid entity. The girl reached out with one small hand toward Margaret's face, and Margaret felt cold radiating from those approaching fingers, felt frost forming on her skin. And just as the hand was about to make contact, the conservatory door slammed open, and Mr. Grimshaw appeared, his face actually showing emotion for the first time Margaret had witnessed, pure fury. "Catherine," he shouted, and his voice carried a force that made the windows rattle. "You know the rules. You are not to interact with the current bride. Return to your room immediately." The ghost girl's mouth snapped shut to its normal size, and her expression changed from predatory interest to something like fear, and she faded quickly, dissolving like mist in sunlight, and Margaret was left standing there with frost still clinging to her face and chest where the cold had touched her. Mr. Grimshaw approached and examined her carefully, his skeletal hands hovering near her skin, but not quite touching. "Are you harmed?" he asked, and Margaret shook her head. "Did you speak to her? Did you make any sound at all in her presence?" Margaret shook her head again, more vigorously, and Mr. Grimshaw's expression shifted back to its normal neutrality. "Good. Catherine is one of the more dangerous ones because she died before the entity had finished with her, choked on her own vomit after 3 weeks of terror. Poor creature, and the entity partially consumed her, but couldn't extract all the sound it wanted, so it keeps her trapped in a half-state, more fully under its control than the others, more willing to serve as its hunter." He gestured for Margaret to follow him out of the conservatory, and they walked together back to the main house. And Mr. Grimshaw spoke more freely than he had since the first night, as if the incident with Catherine had broken some barrier of professional distance. "The ghosts are not your friends," he said as they climbed the main staircase. "Elizabeth may seem sympathetic, may appear to be trying to help you, but she exists at the entity's sufferance and serves its purposes, whether she intends to or not. Her warnings are designed to increase your fear, to make you hyper-aware of danger, to keep you in a constant state of anxiety that the entity finds delicious. Catherine is more overtly hostile, but in some ways less dangerous because her threat is obvious. The one you must truly watch for is Anne, because Anne was the cleverest of all the previous brides, and she nearly found a way to destroy the entity before she failed and was consumed, and the entity keeps her locked deeper than the others, in the central room of the eastern wing, and it uses her voice for its most sophisticated lures, because Anne could mimic affection perfectly, could sound like she genuinely cared about whoever she was speaking to. They reached Margaret's room, and Mr. Grimshaw paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "The Duke is pleased with your progress," he said. 10 days of perfect silence is longer than Catherine managed, and equal to Elizabeth's record at this point. He is beginning to believe you might be one of the rare ones, who survives to adulthood, who becomes part of the permanent household rather than just another meal. But do not let this praise make you complacent. The entity is patient, and it is testing you constantly, learning your patterns, discovering your weaknesses. It will find the thing that makes you want to scream. And when it does, it will present that thing to you over and over, until you break. For Elizabeth, it was spiders. She was terrified of spiders, and the entity made them appear everywhere, crawling on her while she slept, dropping from the ceiling onto her food, until one day she woke with her mouth full of them, and screamed. For Catherine, it was darkness. She couldn't bear to be in complete darkness, and the entity would make the lights fail at random times, trapping her in absolute black for hours, until she started crying and couldn't stop. For Anne, it was isolation. She needed human connection, needed to feel less alone, and the entity would show her visions of her family, searching for her, calling her name, and eventually she answered them, not realizing she was answering the entity. Instead, he stepped back from the door, preparing to leave, but he had one final piece of advice. Find something that gives you strength, something that doesn't require sound or interaction with others. Elizabeth drew pictures. Catherine counted things obsessive. Anne wrote poetry, even though no one could read it. These small acts of defiance, these assertions of self in a place designed to erase you, they can be enough to sustain you through the worst moments. The entity wants you to forget who you are, wants you to exist only as a potential sound source. But if you can maintain some core of identity, some activity that reminds you that you're still Margaret Ashworth and not just another scared child waiting to be consumed, you increase your chances of survival dramatically. Then he was gone, and Margaret was alone again, and she thought about what he had said, about finding something that gave her strength, and she realized that the wooden doll her grandmother had carved was that thing, the single object that connected her to a time before Thornwick Manor, before the Duke, before she had been forced into silence. She took it from under her pillow where she kept it hidden and held it close, and she made herself a silent promise that no matter what the entity showed, but it will at least mark him, make him visible to authorities, make it harder for him to continue, even if the entity is somehow restored, or if he tries to make a new bargain with something else. Over the next 3 days, while the girls recovered their strength, and Miss Blackwood quietly arranged for proper clothing and shoes to be donated by village families, Anne and Margaret worked out the details of their story, the version they would tell to the constable and the magistrate, and anyone else who asked questions. They would say they had all been brought to Thornwick Manor under false pretenses, promised positions as servants or companions, but instead subjected to harsh treatment and confinement. They would say the Duke kept them isolated, prevented them from leaving the estate, and that the other servants were complicit in maintaining this imprisonment. They would say that a fire had broken out, cause unknown, and in the chaos of the manor's destruction, they had managed to escape and had walked through the night to reach Ashford-on-the-Moor. It was a simple story, close enough to truth to be believable, sanitized enough to avoid the elements that would make them sound insane. Elizabeth and Catherine, and the 4 other freed girls, whose names Margaret had learned, were Dorothy, Helen, Mary, and Sarah, all of them having been trapped as ghosts for periods ranging from 6 months to 3 years, agreed to support this narrative, understanding that the alternative was risking everything they had gained by escaping. They practiced their stories, made sure the details aligned, prepared themselves for the skepticism and interrogation that would inevitably come. And on the morning of the 4th day, when a man arrived at the inn, identifying himself as constable and asking questions about the smoke that had been seen rising from the direction of Thornwick Manor, Margaret stepped forward and told their carefully constructed lie with a conviction that surprised her, discovering that her 2 weeks of enforced silence had taught her not just how to be quiet, but how to speak with purpose when speech was necessary, how to use words as tools rather than just as expressions of emotion or thought. The constable listened with increasing alarm, taking notes in a small leather-bound book, and when Margaret finished her account, he immediately sent riders to Thornwick Manor to investigate and to London to intercept the Duke before he could disappear or destroy evidence. The magistrate arrived later that day, a thin, severe man named Sir Edmund Hartley, who had the reputation of being incorruptible and who took the girl's testimony with grave seriousness, particularly when Anne mentioned that she had seen records in the Duke's study, a grimoire or chronicle of some kind that documented his acquisition of children. Sir Edmund promised a thorough investigation and assured the girls they would be protected, that they would not be returned to the Duke's custody, that the full weight of the law would be brought to bear on this case regardless of the Duke's title or wealth or connection. What Sir Edmund didn't tell them, what Margaret only learned years later through newspaper accounts and court records, was that when the riders reached Thornwick Manor, they found only ruins still smouldering, and in those ruins they discovered bones, dozens of sets of small bones scattered throughout what had been the eastern wing. Bones that showed signs of having been there for varying lengths of time, some recent and some centuries old. They found the remains of the servants as well, though medical examiners were baffled by the state of the bodies, which appeared to have aged decades or centuries in a matter of hours, dried out and mummified in ways that normal decomposition couldn't explain. And they found Thomas's statue miraculously intact, despite the collapse of the surrounding structure. A perfect stone rendering of a teenage boy holding an empty space where a book had been. Expression frozen in a combination of determination and peace that moved even the hardest of the investigators to tears. The Duke was arrested in London 3 days after the girls' escape, taken into custody as he prepared to board a ship that would have carried him to France, and from there to parts unknown. When the constables found him, they reported that he looked nothing like the descriptions they had been given. Instead of a vigorous 65-year-old man, they found what appeared to be an ancient creature, withered and skeletal, with skin like dried leather and eyes that had gone completely white, blind, and weeping some kind of clear fluid that stained his cheeks. He couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't speak except in whispers, and he died 3 hours after being taken into custody, his body simply giving out as if it had been waiting for centuries to fail and had finally received permission. The official cause of death was recorded as natural causes. Extreme advanced age, though the Duke's documented birth year should have made him only 65, and no autopsy could explain how he had apparently aged 100 years in a matter of days. The scandal that followed consumed British society for months, with newspapers running sensational stories about the monster of Thornwick Manor and the devil Duke, who had imprisoned children in his cursed estate. The full truth never came out. How could it, when the full truth involved entities from beyond reality and magical bargains and ghosts and transformations that violated every known law of nature. But enough emerged to destroy the Thornwick family's reputation permanently and to result in reforms to the laws governing guardianship and child labor. The Thornwick fortune, which proved to be far less substantial than rumored once investigators began examining the actual accounts, was seized by the Crown and used to establish a fund for the protection of orphans and vulnerable children. A small redemption for centuries of horror, but still a concrete change that might prevent future atrocities, even if it couldn't undo past ones. As for Margaret and the 7 freed girls, they became something of a collective ward of Sir Edmund Hartley, who took his responsibility for their welfare seriously and arranged for them to be housed together in a small manor house he owned in Lancashire, far from Yorkshire and the memories it held. He hired tutors for them, ensured they received proper medical care to address the physical and psychological trauma they had endured, and most importantly, he gave them freedom to heal at their own pace, to talk about their experiences, or remain silent as they chose, to begin building lives that were their own rather than lives dictated by poverty or desperation or the malevolence of others. Margaret thrived in this environment, discovered she had a quick mind and a particular aptitude for reading and mathematics, and by the time she was 15, she was helping Sir Edmund with his legal work, researching cases and organizing documents, and learning the mechanisms by which justice, imperfect and incomplete as it might be, functioned in the world. But Margaret never forgot the promise she had made to herself during those final moments at Thornwick Manor. The determination to find other cursed places, if they existed, and to end them as Thomas had ended the Duke's estate. She began collecting information, reading old newspapers for patterns, examining property records for estates that had been owned by the same families for centuries, paying attention to rumors and folklore about haunted houses or aristocratic families with dark reputations, and she found evidence, troubling evidence, that Thornwick Manor had not been unique, that across England and Europe there were at least a dozen other estates where similar patterns appeared. Missing children, ageless aristocrats, properties that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time, households staffed by servants who never aged or changed. Anne joined her in this research, the 2 girls becoming inseparable partners in what they began to call their crusade, though they were careful never to speak of it openly, never to reveal their true purpose to anyone except each other, and eventually to the other freed girls, who all chose to participate in various ways. Elizabeth became their investigator, using her sweet appearance and manner to gain access to households and observe conditions without arousing suspicion. Catherine, despite her young age, proved to have an extraordinary memory and became their archivist, maintaining detailed records of everything they discovered. Dorothy, Helen, Mary, and Sarah all contributed their own skills. Dorothy had a talent for befriending servants and extracting information. Helen could pick locks and bypass security measures. Mary could forge documents when necessary, and Sarah had the ability to move through spaces without being noticed, to become effectively invisible through pure force of will and careful attention to human patterns of perception. By the time Margaret turned 18 in 1849, they had identified 7 estates that showed strong evidence of harboring entities similar to what had existed at Thornwick Manor, and they had developed a methodology for investigating these places, gathering proof, and when proof was insufficient for legal intervention, finding other ways to disrupt the cycles of abuse and horror. They couldn't always save the children already trapped. Some houses were too well defended, some entities too powerful to confront directly, but they could expose the families running these operations, could create scandals that forced them to cease their activities, or at minimum to become so cautious that their feeding schedules were disrupted, giving some of their captives chances to escape. In 1851, Margaret and Anne travelled to Scotland to investigate Blackmore Keep, an ancient fortress owned by the Earl of Dunvegan, where local folklore spoke of children who entered the Earl's service and were never seen again, where strange lights appeared in the towers at night and sounds like singing drifted across the moors, despite no choir being present. They posed as governesses, seeking employment, and managed to gain access to the keep's interior, where they discovered a situation that was simultaneously similar to and different from Thornwick Manor. The Earl had bound not one entity, but three, smaller and less powerful than the Duke's creature, but more numerous, and he fed them not through enforced silence, but through other means, through children forced to sing endlessly until their voices gave out, through children made to laugh at performances of horror and cruelty until laughter became screaming, through children subjected to such terror that their fear had taste and texture and could be harvested like crops. Margaret and Anne couldn't defeat three entities, couldn't perform the kind of sacrificial magic Thomas had used because they didn't have his knowledge or his willingness to die, but they could, and did, start a fire in the keep's ancient foundations, a fire that spread quickly through dry timber and old tapestries, and in the chaos of evacuation, they managed to free 17 children from the towers where they were kept and guide them to safety before the entire structure became engulfed. The Earl and his entities perished in the flames, and while the official story blamed the tragedy on an accidental kitchen fire, Margaret knew better, knew that she and Anne had committed what any court would call mass murder, knew that they had killed, not just the Earl but also dozens of his servants and staff members who might have been innocent or might have been complicit, but who certainly hadn't received any kind of trial or judgment before being sentenced to burn. That night, sitting in an inn miles from the smoking ruins of Blackmore Keep, Margaret had a crisis of conscience that lasted until dawn, wrestling with questions about whether their actions were justice or revenge, whether they had the right to make decisions about life and death without oversight or accountability, whether they were becoming monsters themselves in their efforts to fight monsters. Anne listened to Margaret's doubts and fears without interruption, and when Margaret finally fell silent, exhausted from hours of moral wrestling, Anne said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. "We're not heroes, Margaret. We're not righteous crusaders or champions of good. We're survivors of horror who have chosen to fight against that horror spreading to others, and sometimes fighting horror requires doing horrible things." Thomas knew this when he sacrificed himself. Grimshaw knew this when he let himself crumble to dust rather than continue serving evil. We know it now. The question isn't whether our hands are clean. They're not. They never will be. The question is whether we can live with dirty hands if it means children who would have suffered don't suffer, if it means entities that shouldn't exist are destroyed before they claim more victims. Margaret accepted this answer, not because it was comforting, but because it was true, because she recognized that the world was not a simple place where good and evil were always clearly distinguished, where justice could always be achieved through proper legal channels, where children could be protected through laws and institutions alone. Sometimes protection required vigilantes, required people willing to step outside society's rules and take actions that society would condemn, but that were nonetheless necessary. And if being necessary meant being damned, if saving children meant accepting that her own soul was forfeit, Margaret would make that trade without hesitation, would carry whatever guilt and blood and darkness came with it, because the alternative, doing nothing, allowing the horrors to continue unchallenged, was worse than any personal damnation. Over the next decade, Margaret and her sisters, because that's what they became, the 8 girls from Thornwick Manor, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose into something stronger than family, tracked down and destroyed or disrupted 9 more cursed estates across England, Scotland, eventually continental Europe. Some they burned like Blackmore Keep. Some they exposed through careful gathering of evidence and presentation to authorities who could be trusted. Some they infiltrated and sabotaged from within, turning servants against masters or finding ways to break the magical bindings that sustained the entities. Their methods varied depending on circumstances, but their commitment never wavered, never faltered, even when they lost people. Dorothy died in 1855 during an attempt to free children from a castle in Bavaria, killed by guards before she could complete her mission, and Sarah simply vanished in 1858 while investigating a manor never seen again despite months of searching. Margaret herself nearly died twice, once from a fever contracted while hiding in a flooded cellar during a rescue operation, and once from injuries sustained when an entity that was more physically present than most attacked her leaving scars across her back and arms that never fully healed. But she survived, kept going, kept fighting, driven by memories of Thomas's sacrifice and by the knowledge that every child they saved was a repudiation of what had been done to them, was proof that horror could be resisted, that cycles of abuse could be broken, that even entities from beyond reality could be challenged by determined humans willing to risk everything. By 1860, when Margaret was 29 years old, the crusade had largely succeeded. They had identified and addressed every major cursed estate they could find evidence of, had created enough scandal and disruption that any aristocratic families still harboring entities had either stopped their activities or hidden them so deeply that even Margaret's network couldn't detect them. The work wasn't finished, would never truly be finished, because evil was creative and persistent and would always find new forms. But it had reached a point where Margaret could begin to consider what came next, what life might look like if it wasn't entirely defined by fighting horrors from her past. She married a solicitor named James Whitmore, who knew about her history. She refused to accept any relationship built on deception or secrets, and who supported her work even when it meant long absences and unexplained expenses and occasional visits from women with haunted eyes seeking refuge or assistance. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and Margaret raised them with a combination of love and honesty that would have been considered radical in Victorian England, teaching them from young ages that the world contained both beauty and horror, that privilege carried responsibility, that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of evil. She taught them about Thornwick Manor, about Thomas and Miss Grimshaw, and the 743 children whose names had been in the grimoire. And she taught them that memory was a form of resistance, that refusing to forget meant refusing to allow atrocities to be buried and repeated. Anne never married, choosing instead to dedicate her entire life to the work they had started, and she became something of a legend in certain circles, a woman who appeared whenever children were in danger, who could be neither bribed nor threatened, who seemed to exist partially outside normal social structures and hierarchies. Elizabeth and Catherine, and Helen and Mary all found their own paths. Elizabeth became a teacher, Catherine a doctor, Helen an architect, Mary a writer who published novels about strong girls overcoming impossible circumstances, stories that inspired generations of readers, even though most never knew they were based on literal truth rather than imagination. And Margaret, as she aged into her 40s and then 50s and then beyond, became the keeper of the records, the chronicler of their crusade, the one who maintained detailed accounts of every cursed estate they had found, every child they had saved, every entity they had destroyed or banished. She kept these records hidden, encoded, accessible only to her sisters and to the network of allies they had developed over the years. But she kept them meticulously complete because she knew that forgetting was the greatest danger, that each generation had to be taught about these horrors anew, or they would be repeated, refined, expanded. In 1889, when Margaret was 58 years old, she received a letter from a young woman in America, a girl named Sarah, not their Sarah, but another Sarah, one who had survived something similar to Thornwick Manor in a mansion in New Orleans, asking for help, asking if the stories she had heard were true, if there really were people who fought against the things that lived in the walls of cursed houses, who saved children from entities that fed on suffering. Margaret wrote back immediately, and the correspondence that followed led to the expansion of their network across the Atlantic, led to the discovery that America had its own cursed estates, its own families who had made terrible bargains, its own children who needed rescuing. The work never ended. and Margaret came to understand that it would outlive her, that what she and her sisters had started would need to be continued by future generations, that there would always be a need for people willing to fight against horrors that most of society refused to acknowledge existed. She began training others, carefully selecting individuals who had the combination of courage and trauma and moral flexibility required to do what needed doing, and by the time she died in 1912 at the age of 81, she had created an organization that would persist for decades, that would adapt to new centuries and new technologies while maintaining its core mission of protecting children from entities that should never have been permitted to enter the human world. Margaret's last words, spoken to Anne, who sat beside her deathbed holding her hand, were simple and direct. "Don't let them forget, Thomas. Don't let them forget any of the 743. Memory is the dowry we inherited, the silence we broke, the price we paid, and the gift we received. Keep the records. Tell the stories. Make sure every child who comes after knows that horror can be survived, that entities can be defeated, that even in the darkest places, even when all hope seems lost, there are people who will fight for you, who will burn down cursed manors and face down ancient evils and give their lives if necessary to ensure that children are protected, are valued, are never again treated as commodities to be sold or as food to be consumed." Anne kept that promise, and the organization Margaret had founded, known only as the Dowry, a name that confused outsiders but carried deep meaning for those who understood the reference, continued its work through 2 world wars and into the modern era, adapting its methods, but never compromising its core mission. And in the archives of the Dowry, kept in a secure location known only to its current leaders, there sits a stone statue of a boy, 14 years old, holding an empty space where a book once was, expression frozen in eternal determination and peace. And beside that statue sits a wooden doll, carved by a grandmother, long dead, and next to that doll sits a grimoire, burned and damaged, but still partially readable, chronicling 743 names, 743 children, who died at Thornwick Manor between 1623 and 1840. Their dowry of silence transformed by Margaret Ashworth and her sisters into something else, into a battle cry, into a promise, into a legacy that ensures their suffering was not meaningless, that their deaths purchased something more valuable than one family's immortality and wealth, that they are remembered, honored, and avenged by every child saved, by every entity destroyed, by every cursed house burned to ashes in the century and more since the night Thornwick Manor fell. And sometimes those who work for the Dowry report, when they're investigating a new cursed estate or planning a rescue operation, or simply sitting in the archives, studying the old records, they hear a voice, a boy's voice, speaking words that carry power even though the speaker has been dead for over a century. "I abjure thee, creature of the spaces between. I deny thy claim on these stones and these souls. I break the covenant made in blood and sealed in silence." And they know that Thomas is still there somehow, still fighting, still protecting, that his sacrifice wasn't just a single moment, but was a perpetual act, that the magic he performed when he turned himself to stone wasn't just about expelling one entity, but was about creating a permanent ward, a guardian spirit that watches over all who fight against the horrors that prey on children, that gives them strength when they falter and courage when they despair and hope when all seems lost. Margaret Ashworth, who entered Thornwick Manor as a commodity worth 30 silver coins, who was told her value lay in her silence, who was meant to be consumed by an entity that had fed on children for 2 centuries, instead became the founder of an organization that has saved thousands of children and destroyed dozens of entities, and proven that even the most powerless, even 9-year-old girls sold by desperate parents, can change the world if they refuse to accept the role others have assigned them, if they transform their suffering into purpose and their silence into speech and their fear into fury that burns down manor houses and challenges creatures from beyond reality and ensures that no child ever has to be a dowry of silence again, that every child's voice is precious and protected and allowed to speak freely without fear of being consumed by the darkness that always waits, hungry and patient, in the spaces between the walls.